So let's talk about pi. Not the delicious flaky kind, or the transcendental number kind, but PIE, or the Proto-Indo-European language. We didn't always sound remotely the same as we do now, but a lot of languages, more than you may think, actually come from the same historical tongue. But how can we know that when there's no one around to ask? Please, check these methods and results with us today. I am O.T. Lieberman, and this is the Ling Space.
Herzlich willkommen.
Welcome to the Ling Space.
Languages are amazing. They change and evolve over time, adapting to suit the needs and whims of their speakers. And everything changes. Word usage, pronunciation, phonology, syntax, the whole system. You can see language change at work all around you right now, but it's even clearer when you look backwards. Books written 100 years ago don't sound the same as those written today. They sound like Sherlock Holmes, the last novel of which came out in 1915. And if you go even further back, Shakespeare's English was in a very different idiom than the one I'm speaking to you in today. But what about further back? Like, we're talking way back. People have been trying to piece together the way their ancestors spoke for centuries. By looking at how a given language has been written over time, you can reconstruct the shape it used to take in the distant past. But at some point you run out of written records to search for changes, so then what do you do? Well, the more you observe your language and the ones around you, the more you might notice certain similarities. Like, say I speak French, and I notice that my word for wing, aile, looks like ala in Spanish and Italian, and even kind of like asa in Portuguese. Intriguing. Could it be that these languages are somehow related? The answer in this case is yes. They're all Romance languages and they share a common ancestor. You can look at the words and grammatical systems of French and Spanish and Italian and see some real parallels, and wouldn't you know it, all roads lead to Rome. If you want to find the closest linguistic ancestor of these languages, you don't need to look any further than Latin. When we look for parallels between languages like this to build their phonology, we use what's called the comparative method, and there's a really systematic way to go about it. The first thing you need to do is find cognates. These are words in different languages that have similar sounds and similar meanings, like our wing example from before, or the English hound and German Hund for dog. Once you have a list of cognates, then you look at the ways they're different from each other. Let's say you want to rebuild the Proto-Polynesian language, which is what people would have been speaking in the Central Pacific a few centuries BCE, so before the Polynesian people spread further across the islands and the languages begin to diversify. You'd look at a few languages in the family, like say Hawaiian, Maori, and Tongan, and then you'd line up your cognates. If all these languages are related, you'll probably find a bunch of words that sound basically the same. Like, if the word for bird in all three languages is manu, you can assume that was probably the word in Proto-Polynesian too. And on top of that, you can assume that the language had all the sounds that make that word up. M, a, n, and u. But of course, not everything is going to be the same. Otherwise, all your languages would still be the same language. So take a word like bat. In Hawaiian, it's pe'a, but in Maori and Tongan, it's peka. Well, this gives us p and a as additional likely phonemes of Proto-Polynesian. But what about that second consonant in the word? Would the ancestor word have an or a k? Well, we can't really tell just looking at that example. It could be either. So we need to look elsewhere in the language for more data. So let's add a word to our data set, the one for current. This is au in Hawaiian and Maori, but au in Tongan with that glottal stop on the front. Aha! Since there's no reason to assume a language would just throw in a new random sound, in this particular word it's likely that the glottal stop was there in au in Proto-Polynesian, and then got lost over time in Hawaiian and Maori. Okay, now we know that the Proto-Polynesian glottal stop just up and vanished in the phonology of its daughter language, Hawaiian. So let's look at the word for bat again and try to get an answer. If it had been pe'a underlyingly, you'd have expected it to turn into pe'a in Hawaiian. Historical change happens across the board in the same phonological environments. It doesn't pick and choose which words to apply to. But we don't get that, we get pe'a. So it looks like the underlying phoneme was k in the original, and that Hawaiian had that k transform into a glottal stop over time. By using these comparisons and looking between languages, we can build a whole sound system up. Give a quick check to make sure that what you came up with makes sense with how phonology works overall, and you're set. You've reached your proto goal. By looking for cognates, we can find what languages should be grouped together. And we've puzzled out a few of these family trees. If we look at the over 6,000 languages in the world today, along with the ones that have disappeared over time, we can collect them into a few major groups and a whole lot of smaller ones. There's actually over 100 language families out there, but the 10 biggest ones capture about 75% of the languages in the world. The Niger-Congo and Austronesian families have over 1,000 languages in them each. But if each family tree consists of a whole lot of branches, that makes you wonder, what's at the trunk? Well, let's take the example of the language family spoken in Europe and the Indian subcontinent. The ancestor here is called PIE, or Proto-Indo-European. Although we have no way of knowing for sure what Proto-Indo-European sounded like, or if it even existed, a ton of research has been done on it, and most linguists agree that the theory is solid. After all, scholars have been puzzling out PIE since the 18th century. Different versions and approaches have battled it out in the 200 years since, but there's a few things we have a pretty good grasp on. The best guess that most people have today is that it was spoken in about 3500 BCE and started out in the steppes of Eastern Europe. Over time, the language spread out and changed and evolved into over 400 different languages in Europe and the Indian subcontinent. Germanic languages like English and Dutch, Romance languages like Spanish and Italian, Slavic languages like Polish or Russian, Indo-Iranian languages like Hindi and Urdu, and more. Let's look at some examples of cognates from across these. The word for house was probably dome in PIE, and is domus in Latin, domos in Greek, dama in Sanskrit, and zimmer in German. And snow has been reconstructed in PIE as snig, like in Polish śnieg, Old Norse snjor, Sanskrit sneha, and Irish sneachta. And we could list off a lot more examples for each of these. So, by analyzing connections between related languages and using the comparative method, linguists have figured out a lot about the likely phonology of PIE. For example, English has the alveolar plosives t and d, but PIE probably had t, d, and d, a voiced aspirated sound. Now, some bits of the reconstruction seem to be a little weird. Like, it had p and b, but probably no b, which is something that you'd expect to be there. And having those voiced aspirated sounds and not voiceless aspirated ones is at best super rare. But that's where our method leads us, and it seems like it checks out. So, like we said, there are a whole lot of language families, of which PIE is just the most widely studied one. But why stop there? Is there a way to link together all the families and get some kind of proto-human language? Well, people have tried, but unfortunately, even if something like that existed at some point, we almost certainly can't rebuild it. It's already really challenging to go back even a few thousand years without records to work from. Going back even more is just an insurmountable problem. After all, we want to rule out any similarities due to chance, and it's too easy to make mistakes when we start operating as abstractly as we have to if we want to make Proto-Human a thing. Trying to match hypothesized Proto-Human roots to actual languages doesn't always line up well. Like, there's no match for the proposed ancient root for woman anywhere in Spanish. All the possible cognates that it could match up with actually came from other sources. And if we try working out what the syntax looked like, we just end up guessing. We can't skate by these issues with any confidence. What we know about the speech of early humans isn't a whole lot, but here's what we can say. If we're holding to the position that universal grammar is hardwired in our brains, then it's probably been around for as long as our noggins have been the way that they are. So maybe although we can't figure out the specifics of its phonology and syntax, we can assume that early human speech would have had recursion and binding and movement and allophones and assimilation and all of the universals we see today that make up the whole UG apparatus. Looking back into the past of language, things can get pretty misty, but our knowledge about where our speech comes from isn't all bitty and small. Using our techniques and working carefully, we can learn a lot about where we came from, and all that research definitely merits a piece of pie. So we've reached the end of the Ling space for this week. If you reconstructed my phonemic inventory, you learned that we've established over 100 language families by finding cognates and then using the comparative method on them. That we can reconstruct ancient languages like Proto-Indo-European by working back from these cognates. And that we probably can't rebuild any languages further back than that with any real accuracy. The Ling space is produced by me, Moti Lieberman. It's directed by Delelise Prévost, and it's written by both of us. Our editor is Georges Coulombe, our production assistant is Stéphane Herdepes, our music is by Shane Turner, and our graphics team is Atelier Muse. We're down in the comments below, or you can bring the discussion back over to our website where we'll have some extra material on this topic. And while you're there, check out our store. We've got some really cool linguistic stuff. Check us out on Tumblr, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you want to keep expanding your own personal Ling space, please subscribe. And we'll see you next Wednesday. Walete!